Hi, welcome to episode 2 of the podcast. We are doing another Black History deep dive today. This is actually a continuation of a series, and this is part 2 in my series on the genocide in the Belgian Congo. So if you haven't listened to the first episode, I strongly recommend that you do, because in the first episode, we're going to sort of talk about the Congo Kingdom prior to the genocide, the first meeting of Europeans on this part of the African continent, as well as some of the background of King Leopold, the man who is responsible for this genocide. So we are here today to talk about the genocide in the Belgian Congo, where 8 to 10 million people were murdered. We're going to talk some more about King Leopold in this episode and the explorer Henry Stanley. So before we talk about King Leopold, we need to talk about another figure who will become important to this story. So Henry Morton Stanley is the man who many believe inspired Joseph Conrad's character, Mr. Kurtz. And he was, quite frankly, a very racist man. He had a strong belief in European superiority that he held throughout his life. Henry Morton Stanley was born in Wales in 1841, and he was one of several children born out of wedlock to a housemaid named Betsy Parry. So there are 3 possible men who may have been his father, but currently Henry Stanley's paternal origins are still unknown. He was originally born John Rowlands, but he later changed his name to Henry Stanley, which we'll get to in a bit. He had a tumultuous childhood, and his mother had more children than she could handle. So when her son, at the time John Rowlands, was 6 years old, he became an inmate at St. Asaph's Union Workhouse. And this was essentially a place that was a mixture of an orphanage and a workhouse, describing 2 of England's favorite things: orphanages and child labor. Children would work and sleep in dormitories, and they were cared for. In theory, of course. In reality, sexual abuse of the children in these sorts of institutions was rampant, and this was an overall pretty unpleasant living situation for all of them. Betsy Parry went on to drop off several more of her children at the workhouse, leading to situations where John Rowlands basically thought that his mother had come back to retrieve him from this pretty bad situation, but she never returned and she never took him back. In February of 1859, when John Rowlands was 18, he was hanging around the docks in Wales, and he met an American merchant who offered him a chance to sail with him. He took this man up on this offer, and he landed in New Orleans, where he left the ship in search of work. In New Orleans, John Rowlands met a middle-aged cotton broker and asked the man for a job, and the man said yes. From that point on, Stanley desperately tried to assimilate into American culture. He gave himself a new name, which is where we get Henry Morton Stanley from, and he even attempted to rewrite his personal biography, confusing details of his life and oftentimes outright lying. When Stanley talked about this portion of his life, he exaggerated a lot, and in the future, piecing together the actual details of his life became so difficult because of all the half-truths and misinformation he floated out there. He lied, exaggerated, and he retold stories to make himself appear more like a hero than he actually was. So, for example, when he had recounted leaving the orphanage, he acted that like he leapt over a garden wall to escape, when what is really more likely is he aged out of being in a children's orphanage. He also claimed to have led a rebellion of his entire class at the workhouse, but this did not actually happen, and there was no evidence of such a thing having ever occurred. When the American Civil War began, Stanley really supported the cause of the Confederates, and he joined the Confederate Army. In April 1862, when he was 21 years old, Stanley went into combat with his regiment of Arkansas Volunteers at the Battle of Shiloh in Tennessee. He was eventually captured and taken as a prisoner of war by the Union soldiers, during which time he witnessed more battle, this time from the Union side. He deserted the army shortly afterward and continued to travel. He had always been obsessed with geography and telling stories, and he had an obsession with being the hero of his own story, something already noted in his penchant for exaggerating about the events in his life. And if you remember from episode 1, I talked about how King Leopold had a very similar interest in geography and a similar interest in grandiose visions, so to speak. So Stanley traveled to Turkey, and then he returned to the US and began his career as a newspaperman. He wrote stories about various events in the United States, but what really kicked off his career was some writing he did about the French-Indian War, which he colored with colorfully racist and stereotypical descriptions of Native Americans that honestly made the Americans lose their minds. They loved it. Given the time, this won Stanley a lot of attention from Americans who appreciated his flattering portrayal of the white race. So this is why I said that he was racist earlier. I wasn't trying to be glib, but he propagandized white supremacy. He fought on the side of white supremacists during the Civil War. This was a pretty big part of his personal philosophy by his own account. I'm not saying this to apply a modern standard, but this was his genuine philosophy. So the Herald, an English newspaper, was so impressed by his success, as he'd written several stories with similar colonial themes, that they basically asked him to become a permanent roving correspondent, but to do that, he would have to be based out of London. So British people were kind of doing something they tend to do, which is they were on this very big moral superiority high horse to the United States. They were really involved in this new idea that they were anti-slavery because they had ended slavery in the British West Indies in 1831, and they kind of rewrote history to act like this was out of the goodness of their hearts rather than the fact that slavery was no longer profitable for them because the rebellions in the Caribbean made it impossible for them to afford to continue slavery. So the British people didn't take out this anti-slavery sentiment on the Spanish or the Portuguese, who had millions of slaves in their colonies in areas such as Cuba or Brazil. The British had decided that the main perpetrators of bad slavery were the Arabs, and they believed that because the Arabs were a lesser race, Arab slavery was a unique evil that had to be stopped. Of course, when white people did slavery, they did it the right way, but the Arabs did it the wrong way. The British interest in the Arab slave trade, along with their interest in, quote, discovering natural resources like diamond, gold, and various minerals in Africa, renewed the British interest in exploration for the purpose of spreading Christianity. And if you need it spelled out, this was a thin disguise for their true interest, prospecting for natural resources, such as the ones I just mentioned, so that they could enrich themselves. So, Morton Stanley is here. He's writing. He's just gone back to England, but he's posing as an American at this point in time. The English are interested in going back into Africa to, quote, spread Christianity. And I'm going to have to pause on Henry Morton Stanley to connect him to Africa and the British by talking about another figure briefly who purveyors of English history may recognize the name of, David Livingstone. David Livingstone is, for some, a hero. He was a physician, prospector, missionary, explorer, and at one point even a British consul. David Livingstone wandered across Africa for 3 decades, beginning in the early 1840s. He searched for the source of the Nile, he denounced slavery, found Victoria Falls, looked for minerals, and preached the gospel. Livingstone became a national hero in England for being the first white man to walk from coast to coast of Africa. So, David Livingstone, huge figure at the time, basically a celebrity, and Stanley heard about him when he was in England and saw an opportunity to gain fame by finding David Livingstone. So, why did he need to find David Livingstone? In 1866, Livingstone had gone on another long expedition, but no one had seen or heard from him in several years. Henry Stanley saw this opportunity to get fame for himself and attach himself to the name of someone who was a hero in England. So he decided to go to Africa to do just that. And yes, we are not yet connected to King Leopold, but this is all going to fit together. So much of Stanley's life was characterized by his belief in the superiority of the white race, and this was honestly one of the main themes of all of his writings, aside from making himself look as good as humanly possible with stories that were dubious at best. So he goes to Africa on his search for Livingstone, and he writes furiously, making it a point to express his disdain for all the lower races he encountered in his journals, and he found himself particularly disgusted by half-caste people, what we would call today in the United States mixed race people. So, a hot take if we've ever heard one. Anyway, in 1871, Stanley embarked on this massive exploration mission, accompanied by around 190 men. So at this time, I don't really know how they would have known what David Livingstone looked like or how they would have been able to verify finding him. And you'll see why I just said that in a second. So Stanley and his expedition marched inland from the eastern coast of Africa in search of a man who hadn't been seen in over 5 years. There are several accounts during this period of Stanley's brutal abuse of Africans during his quest, and he worked people to the bone, such as locals who would have had knowledge of the area and so forth. He took advantage of them, and then he would write about them, basically describing them like they were trash. So after 8 months, Stanley claimed to find Livingstone. Apparently, though, luckily for Stanley and anyone who might have wanted any verification for this story, Livingstone decided to remain in Africa and died soon afterwards. Now, this is in my opinion. There appears to be very little proof that he actually found Livingstone. I have questions, and those questions do not get answered. There doesn't seem to be much official dispute about whether he found Livingstone or not, but I question that for many reasons. Stanley told his story with typical exaggeration, which I would refer to as lying, adding details of the most exotic lands, faithful servants, and basically fetishizing every ethnic group he came across, and he even added some fresh new stereotypes to the mix about Africans so the British populace could have some funky, fresh new racism to sink their teeth into. So some of his writings include phrases like, "The Arab never changes," "The Banyan is a born traitor," "For the half-castes I have great contempt." So he was a regular charmer, and apparently the British agreed, and Stanley garnered quite a bit of fame for, quote, finding Livingstone, a man who never lived to tell the tale or say, "Hey, they found me, it's actually true," and word of Stanley's exploration spread, and his word spread to a man who we've all heard about if we've listened to part 1, King Leopold II, and this is basically how they get connected. So let's get into it. In this part, we're going to talk Henry meets Leopold. When Leopold's father died and he finally took the throne, he still hadn't given up his goal of expanding the Belgian Empire. At this point in time, political opinion in Europe was changing. The British Empire had abolished slavery, as we mentioned previously, and they had changed their tack on the slavery question, taking a hard moral stance against the Arab slave trade, and completely missing the irony, if you ask me. King Leopold knew that if he ever wanted to make his dreams about finding profits for himself in Africa, he would basically have to be really sneaky about it. And if we remember what we learned in the first podcast about this, sneaky was kind of King Leopold's thing. It was his brand. So the tides were changing when it came to Europe's public perception of slavery. And if Leopold found the profits he dreamed of, and it was too obvious that, Belgium was really raking it in, other countries with greater resources than Belgium would have easily had the means to push him out and take the profits for themselves. So eventually, Leopold arranged a meeting with Stanley, and that meeting sealed the fate of the Congo region. The two of them were, in my opinion, again, a match made in hell. They both had grandiose fantasies. Stanley fancied himself a hero, and he'd garnered a lot of recent fame, as we discussed, for finding David Livingstone. So remember, a lot of what he reported was embellished with numerous falsehoods, but he acquired fame for it nevertheless, and this forged his connection with King Leopold II. Not only did King Leopold II become enamored with Stanley's stories, but they shared similar scruples. Neither of them were above dishonesty for the purposes of getting what they wanted. Stanley had basically lied his way to the top of English milieu, and Leopold, as we learned in part 1, was well known for using subterfuge to get his way. More critically, when they met, they both had what the other wanted. Leopold obviously couldn't just go to Africa himself, since he was the king and he had a family and various other duties, and let's be real, most likely straight up didn't want to go, but he had plenty of money to fund an expedition. And Stanley, like most European explorers, required funding to continue his various expeditions/exploits. So they came to an agreement. Leopold II agreed to pay Stanley 25,000 francs a year for his time spent in Europe and 50,000 a year for his time spent in Africa. So in today's dollars, that 50,000 a year would have been 250K a year, which is, I think, as much as a Supreme Court justice makes a year, I think. So that is a crazy amount of money, regardless of whether that little tidbit is correct. And it's a lot of money, so he was going to be really well paid for this little looting project. Additionally, Leopold agreed to fund the rest of the expedition, which included not just paying for men and supplies, but for road constructions, trading stations, and supplies to make the river more navigable for Europeans. A huge part of the reason Leopold was willing to invest this much money for this mission was because he hoped to find ivory. Europeans perceived the supply of ivory as virtually endless, which we know today is patently false. And ivory was high in value, had multiple uses, and it was effectively a get-rich-quick scheme. You find ivory, insta-money. Once Leopold came to an explicit agreement with Stanley, he set upon garnering press attention, which had the goal of doing some additional fundraising for this expedition. Leopold spoke to the press numerous times and spread the word around Europe at different events for the wealthy. Leopold was adamant that everyone view his mission as purely philanthropic, and he made it explicit to Stanley that this was the narrative he expected Stanley to maintain. Stanley ended up becoming a little bit of a loose cannon later on, but Leopold tried to keep him in line, and when that didn't work, a lot of times he just tried to keep him in Africa. Leopold II claimed that his mission into Africa was an abolitionist mission, and effectively the 19th century version of invading a country to, quote, spread democracy. He played into the European opposition to the Arab slave trade, acting like a part of his mission's purpose was to put a stop to the Arab slave trade as well. And people believed him. I think it was probably a mixture of that, and they didn't question him very much because, again, as I mentioned in episode 1, nobody was checking for Belgium. No one was taking Miss Belgium seriously at all. Leopold went so far as to make an entire cover organization called the International Association of the Congo, which had its own flag. It is bone-chilling how history repeats itself when it comes to European exploitation in Africa. Seriously blows my mind, because even today, people of European descent who have these various corporate looting projects in Africa create false charities, shell corporations, and whatnot to pursue their individual gain in this part of the world. I highly recommend this book entitled The Looting Machine by Tom Burgess to explore that a little bit more, and I will definitely be deep diving into some of the subjects covered in The Looting Machine in a future episode. But let's keep going. I got off topic a little there. So no one had any reason to doubt the veracity of Leopold's mission, at least no one European, who were the only people consulted in the first place, because at the end of the day, we're going to have a moment of real talk, moment of science. The Europeans might have changed their minds about slavery and acted like this was because of some moral realization, but the truth was they never loosened their grip on the strong cultural conviction of European superiority over the African people. And even today, some may wonder if that conviction remains. So naturally, international perception of King Leopold was at an all-time high because he'd been seriously working the press. Baroness Burdett Coutts, the British patron of missionaries, gave him a donation of 50,000 francs for his humanitarian endeavors. Bless his heart. And I just want to remind you that this is equivalent to 250,000 US dollars in today's dollars. In the United States, one writer declared Leopold's great work enough to make an American believe in kings forever. Honestly, these people were full of hot takes. Wow. So, quick recap about the territory they were about to enter. When we last left the Congo in part 1 of the series, the Congo Kingdom had lost a final battle against the Portuguese. Now, the Portuguese still had control of that area, but their grasp was tenuous and weakening. And Stanley's presence in the Congo region would make the situation for the people inhabiting the Congo much, much worse. So we're here in Africa, Henry Morton Stanley, his money from Leopold, his European workers, and his Africans who are slaves. And, this is where we're at. There was already European presence and there was slavery in the region, so Stanley and the Europeans on the expedition took advantage of that. They needed local guides, people with knowledge in the area, and they also, quote-unquote, needed people to exploit and force to do the hardest and most grueling parts of the work needed to cross the treacherous Congo River basin. So this is why, again, in part 1, I talked about things that may have seemed irrelevant, like describing the Congo River. But it's because this was very treacherous. It took so much work to navigate, to travel the forest, and it also required a lot of lumberjacking. Is that what you call it when you cut wood? Chopping down wood, all of this stuff just to get through this area. And that's why I brought that up before. It's all connected. So when it came to forced labor, Stanley was renowned for being particularly brutal. He believed that irons were the best punishment for laborers who didn't work hard enough, but this punishment he exclusively used on Black people. Stanley spoke in awe of this particular punishment because of the following benefits, which I'll quote to you now. His words are, "So powerful, because without wounding, disfiguring, or torturing the body, irons inflicts shame and discomfort." Very bone-chilling what his, philosophy on this stuff was in general. Stanley put all people beneath him, including Africans, in danger of illness and death. 22 Africans and 6 Europeans died in the first year, with one of them getting eaten by a crocodile, which is very messed up. Stanley was happy to exploit the African population of the area, and he often wrote of his vitriolic contempt for the indigenous people in the area. Stanley became known by the Africans who worked for him as Bula Matari or Bula Matari, which is called breakstones. Stanley himself preferred the grander translation, breaker of rocks, and claimed that it was bestowed on him when he taught odd Africans how to use a sledgehammer, which is BS. This man honestly could not stop lying. It was, in a way, literally his job. He lied like it was his job, and it was. True manifestation, the secret girly. So his sense of superiority didn't only extend to his desire to subjugate and enslave Africans. Henry Stanley saw himself and all Europeans as morally superior to African people. He loathed Africans' traditional tattoos and their lack of clothing. He had a hatred for women in particular, who he felt were third-class citizens, and in his mind, they had far too much freedom in the different societies that existed. After several bouts of illness, Stanley returned to Europe. But after only 2 months, fearing the French advancement into Africa, Leopold and Stanley decided that Stanley should return to Africa to continue his program of colonization, exploration, and conquest. Doctors advised Stanley that after several bouts of malaria and other endemic illnesses, this was a bad idea, but Leopold would not hear of it. Stanley in Europe put King Leopold's public relations campaign at risk. While Leopold had spread the word of his lofty, noble, and moral ideals in the Congo, Stanley brazenly spoke of his true intentions, his dream for profit and colonization. King Leopold wrote to Stanley, and in this private letter asked him to purchase all the ivory in the Congo for sale. Leopold also consulted a lawyer inquiring into the legality of private corporations signing treaties with indigenous African chiefs. And he instructed Stanley to use his military force to coerce chiefs into signing these treaties where they granted everything in their territories to King Leopold. Now, I'm going to pause here and remind you that this is not happening under the flag of Belgium. This is happening under the flag of the International Association of the Congo. So when England colonizes, I assume they used the Union Jack back then. I'm sure a British history buff will yell at me if I'm wrong, but they would throw up their Union Jack. If the French colonized, they would throw up, the blue, white, and red. But when Belgium colonized, or King Leopold colonized, there was that blue flag with the yellow star. So this is part of what I meant in part 1 when I talked about this being one man's pet project. This point, where King Leopold sought into the legality of turning this land into a corporate entity, this was a turning point for the different peoples of the Congo. Over 450 chiefs, although estimates vary, signed over a total trade monopoly with King Leopold at the behest of Henry Stanley and his military officers, who planted the blue flag with a gold star wherever they went. Whenever Europeans or Americans questioned the rumors they heard about this land grab, Leopold assuaged their concerns by promising that he was liberating the African region to free trade. Just what everyone needs right before they get murdered en masse. Free trade. We love that. Hashtag sarcasm, in case this is the second episode and you don't know that's how I am yet. So now when we talk about treaties, we aren't talking about agreements where there was complete and equivalent understanding between both parties as to the agreement signed. Many chiefs had never seen the written word before, and as far as they knew, a treaty of friendship didn't entitle the co-signers to complete domination over their land, people, and territory. The treaties were largely manipulations done by Stanley, but ordered by King Leopold to manipulate chiefs out of their lands and freedoms. And so this is why I say they were co-conspirators in this genocide, because King Leopold maintained a very safe distance from the genocide that he perpetrated. And this is a very interesting similarity we see in other genocides we may study. Two of the ones that I happen to be most familiar with would be the Holocaust and the Rwandan genocide, where the people ordering the genocide tend not to be the ones, doing the most to perpetrate this genocide. And you can see some similarities here with King Leopold. So I'm going to quote to you something. On November 1st, 1884 was when most of these trades were signed, and this quote describes this trade. In return for 1 piece of cloth per month to each of the undersigned chiefs, besides present of cloth in hand, they promised to, freely of their own accord, for themselves and their heirs and successors forever, give up to the said association the sovereignty and all sovereign and governing rights to all their territories, and to assist, by labor or otherwise, any works, improvements, or expeditions which the said association shall cause at any time to be carried out in any part of these territories. All roads and waterways running through this country, the right of collecting tolls on the same, and all game, fishing, mining, and forest rights are to be the absolute property of the said association. By labor or otherwise, Stanley's pieces of cloth bought not just land, but manpower. It was an even worse trade than the Indians made for Manhattan. So, not my terminology, it's a quote. But this is very interesting, and I honestly encourage you to listen to this piece again, because this is the worst deal in the history of trade deals. I feel like that's a Donald Trump quote, so yikes. Big yikes over here for me. But yeah, it was a very bad deal. So let's discuss and do a little refresh on the territory conquered here and who's here, what's going on. King Leopold and Stanley acquired territory that extended far past the Congo Kingdom that would have basically been on the coast. This included various ethnic groups. Some of these groups were peaceful, but others were not. There were a very large range of cultural practices, some of them wholly taboo in Western society today, like ritual cannibalism or clitoridectomies. So this region also had an advanced production of artwork, which I find very interesting because this artwork later influenced Westerners like Matisse, Braque, and Picasso without providing much credit to the originators. So the genre, Cubism, came from the Congo, and there was nothing like it in Europe at all. Cubism originated from this area because of the specific spiritual, cultural, and societal practices that allowed for greater fluidity of perception and an understanding of artistic proportion and form that lacked European rigidity. I find this fascinating because these contributions to art are basically largely ignored, or they were ignored until much later when Europeans appropriated these different styles. And today, I think we associate Cubism, for example, with Picasso and not an entire region of millions of people where Cubism was kind of like the artistic norm. So, in the areas stolen by Leopold and Stanley, different ethnic groups lived in harmony with the land. So, when I talk about harmony with the land in this context, I'm not talking about this kind of John Muir notion of idyllic, untouched land. Humans lived there and, they made use of plants and animals, but they lived sustainably more or less, and they understood the natural rhythms of the place where they lived. So, they had managed to go, probably centuries without depleting all the ivory, por ejemplo. So, with Stanley and Leopold manipulating their way into a complete monopoly of land resources and manpower, which I, choose to refer to as slave labor, this was all about to change. And while their plots fomented in Africa, Leopold sought the approval and allyship of the United States in his colonization. So, the US President, Chester Arthur, shortly after accusations of corruption and mismanagement as the collector of customs revenue at the port of New York, he had risen to the highest office in the land after the assassination of James A. Garfield. A man named General Henry Shelton Sanford, who helped Leopold to recruit Stanley in the first place, became Leopold's spokesperson on American soil, converting Chester Arthur into a supporter of Leopold's noble cause of civilization. So Chester Arthur receives Sanford at the White House, and there, Sanford explained to him what Leopold accomplished in the Congo by virtue of coercing African leaders to sign treaties, which of course Sanford presented entirely differently. Sanford to Arthur, described these treaties as similar to the ones that the Puritans signed with the natives of America in the 1600s, which to me would have been a red flag, but to a corrupt customs collector in New York probably sounded pretty freaking good. So Sanford promised Chester Arthur that this Belgian expansion into the Congo would be a good thing because this would support U.S. free trade in Africa and there would be no duties on U.S. goods entering the region. He even showed President Arthur an authentic treaty Leopold had given Sanford with deceptive intentions. So this treaty that Leopold gave Sanford to show Arthur had been drawn up between Leopold's private association and the Belgian Congo. But this copy of the treaty conveniently left out all the parts where the treaty actually promised a trade monopoly, so none of these promised benefits to the US would ever actually materialize, and we see Sly Fox Leopold strike again, where he's pretending there's going to be free trade, but he's only using this as a manipulation to get US support, and there is not going to be free trade. President Arthur addressed Congress, and the words from his speech came directly from Sanford. Leopold became giddy to hear his own propaganda line recited by the President of the United States. With Congress on board and many disgruntled Confederate soldiers, racists, still in politics, the Americans saw this as a potential opportunity. The disgraced Confederates, racists, experienced a lot of resentment that having lost the war, they had to share space with freed slaves, and they wanted to send these slaves back to Africa. And they saw Leopold's conquered territories as having a lot of potential for that agenda. So the United States became the first country to publicly recognize the legitimacy of Leopold's claim on the Congo, offering public support and U.S. money to the beginnings of King Leopold's genocidal project. This helped Leopold to win over the French, British, and the Germans, who had varying opinions on whether Leopold's project would pan out. The important thing was, None of the other European interests saw him as a threat. So I wonder why. I mean, there was probably many reasons why he went to seek allyship with the US, but I think a part of it is that he didn't actually want European powers looking too closely. The United States is kind of far away. They had their own problems, having just had the Civil War. So he wanted an ally that was strong, but not strong enough to kind of upend his interests, is kind of my interpretation of the events. None of the European interests are seeing Leopold as a threat here, and for all their talk of abolition and their new culture against slavery, their primary concern wasn't potential exploitation, but the protection of economic interests. So King Leopold's bold claims abroad in the US sparked an African land rush with such a palpably greedy air that even disturbed Stanley, who was no stranger to unfettered greed himself. Europeans gathered at the Berlin Conference to divide up African territories, with literally zero consultation of the people who lived there. And King Leopold wasn't at the table, but he came out the largest winner. The conference ended in February 1885 with no other country bothering with the vast interior that Leopold promised to, quote, conquer with railroads and steamboats, and all of them applauding his efforts at civilizing what they viewed as the heart of darkness. The African land Leopold acquired was over 76 times the size of Belgium, and in Europe they referred to him as the Congo's king sovereign, but Leopold referred to himself as Congo's proprietor. So we spoke in part 1 about how Leopold's acts in the Congo were separate from the nation of Belgium, and I want to circle back to that a little bit. Reminder, recap, refresh, we're getting this in the membrane. He conducted all of this under a private corporation, the International African Association, that King Leopold II was the sole owner of, hence the proprietor. This was in no way shared with the Belgian government, nor the cabinet ministers who discovered Leopold's expansion in the newspaper like the rest of Belgian civilians, the equivalent of a hypothetical president tweeting out policy, and that's when his cabinet finds out. Not like that would ever happen in this timeline. Leopold began to run into money problems relatively quickly after gaining the lands that he wanted. At the anti-slavery conference in 1889, Leopold affirmed his commitment to ending the vicious and evil Arab slave trade in Africa and offered the services of the new Congo to this noble end. But of course, he would need money to continue. Leopold also petitioned the Belgian parliament for money, roughly $125 million in today's money, promising to bequeath the Congo to Belgium in his will. Wow. The project continued with financial support pouring in, despite various conflicts between Stanley and Leopold that continued. So from Europe's perspective, the Belgian project in the Congo was going well, but there was about to become a whistleblower who would become the first ever person to criticize the human rights violations in the Congo. So getting into that will be the last big chunk in this episode. And then after that, I'm going to get into the next episode and do that, where we're going to get into the gory details of the genocide. But this is a deep dive, and all of this setup is really important to understanding all of the historical context. I mentioned waterfalls and treachery, and that came back to play today. So please trust in me, have some faith, because this stuff is really, really interesting, and it really deserves a very close look. So we're here now, our whistleblower section, and George Washington Williams is our whistleblower, and George Washington Williams is a Black investigative journalist from the United States who wrote an open letter to King Leopold II. He became the first person to dissent to what happened in the Congo, and largely due to racial prejudices. While Leopold II and Henry Stanley are well known throughout the world, George Washington Williams is not. George Washington Williams was born in 1849 in Pennsylvania, and in 1864 he enlisted in the Union Army during the Civil War in the 41st Colored Troops of the Union Army. He fought in several battles, and he was even wounded in combat. Williams also fought in the Army of the Republic of Mexico in the War for Mexican Independence, which wasn't uncommon for Civil War veterans at the time, something I did not know before researching this. After that, he re-enlisted into the Army because because his main skills were related to soldiering. Williams left the army in 1867 and enrolled in Howard University. While Williams later in life would claim a doctorate degree that he never actually received, he was still a brilliant student. After Howard, George Washington Williams went to the Newton Theological Institution just outside of Boston, where he graduated early. I find his life so impressive and so interesting, and it's so fascinating the different things our predecessors went through as Black people. And while I'm not a Black American, I think it's interesting for Black people in America to know what their specific predecessors went through. At this point, George Washington Williams had gone from a semi-literate soldier into a skilled writer and storyteller. George Washington Williams was very passionate about the rights of African Americans. Like many Black Civil War veterans, he was disappointed that the advancements Black Americans hoped for after the Civil War hadn't come to pass. There were also issues with lynchings and KKK violence, so having gone to seminary school, Williams learned the skills to become a powerful orator and to speak on these issues for the Black struggle in America. These events would all lead to him visiting the Congo in the future. Williams married, and he moved from Boston to Washington, D.C., where he founded a Black newspaper called The Commoner. Starting newspapers back then, like right now, was super expensive, and unfortunately it was difficult to make a profit, and the paper went under. Williams spent some time as a columnist before he made a major career shift, deciding to study law and apprentice with a lawyer. In 1879, at the age of 30, he was elected the first Black member of the Ohio State Legislature, where he raised hackles by trying to win repeal of a law banning interracial marriages. He left the legislature after only one term. Williams completed a book before moving on to the next part of his career, and I also find this very interesting. He wrote a massive book published in 2 volumes, and it has one hell of a title, so let's do this. This book was called History of the Negro Race in America from 1619 to 1880, Negroes as Slaves, as Soldiers, and as Citizens, together with a preliminary consideration of the unity of the human family and historical sketch of Africa, and an account of the Negro governments of Sierra Leone and Liberia. So that whole chunk was the title. This book took its readers from early African kingdoms all the way through the Civil War and Reconstruction. He was a great historian who put so much work into his research that it was honestly astounding. He traveled to libraries, wrote to General Sherman, and were it not for his skin color, he would have been way more lauded for his efforts and his sort of writing ability and historical research skills. The New York Times eventually gave him very condescending recognition for his work, but later the great writer W.E.B. Du Bois would call him the greatest historian of the race. In 1889, Williams won a chance to go to Europe to write articles for a European press syndicate. As a descendant of slaves at a time when it was becoming more and more popular to posture an anti-slavery stance, Williams was quite popular. He even interviewed King Leopold II before he ever traveled to Congo, and he thought that Leopold made a good impression. At the time, Williams still bought into the propaganda line that Leopold II's project in the Congo, with all his expenses, he'd done out of the goodness of his heart. Williams had a personal pet project that he was interested in, and Leopold II used that essentially to play him. Williams wanted to eventually put Black people from America to work in the Congo, and Leopold II listened to him intently, which ameliorated Williams to King Leopold II at first. Williams even made an agreement with a Belgian company in Congo, but when he brought his idea to a Black university in Virginia, he essentially received blank stares. There was no buy-in. People had questions about African life that Williams couldn't answer, and so he wasn't really able to recruit anybody. At this point, Williams had to go to Congo to learn more, not only for his future projects, but also for his plans to write another book. In the Congo, Williams' journey along the Congo River proceeded slowly, allowing him plenty of time to observe the real conditions of the Congo and allowing him to see that this was far from the charitable affair that Leopold II advertised internationally. Traveling by steamboat would take you up the Congo River around 30 miles a day, and the ship would then stay moored at a docking station for the nights. Sentries were posted and African woodcutters sent to chop all the wood for the fuel needed the next day, which is a hell of a lot of wood and a hell of a lot of grueling work. Along the route up the river at the mission stations, William could also make keen observations about the reality of the various working conditions throughout the Congo, which of course led to, as I mentioned, him becoming the first whistleblower. Williams eventually couldn't hold back any longer, and he unleashed his full rage at the situation in an open letter to Leopold II, where he described some of the injustices he witnessed. Up until that point, the main critiques of Leopold's Congo were accusations of injustice against foreign traders. So today, we're going to end this little podcast with the main accusations George Washington Williams levied against Stanley and Leopold II's actions in the Congo, because this is getting into the beginning of realizing what's going on and finding out what's going on. And as I mentioned, we will talk about the details in part 3. So first, these are the allegations. Williams alleged that Stanley used party tricks to trick the Africans into thinking that white people had supernatural powers, and he used this to manipulate African leaders into signing over their land. Williams described the different ruses Stanley used and pointed out the unfairness in large tracts of land getting traded for boxes of gin. He pointed out that Stanley wasn't a hero, and that his name provoked terror amongst many of the people Williams talked to. Stanley was a tyrant. He was known for being a liar, he had a violent temper which provoked violent beatings, and he was also known for profane language. This flew right in the face of Stanley's reputation at home in Europe and America, where everyone lauded him as a hero, and George Washington Williams was the only person to document African accounts of how the colonized people perceived Stanley. I find it really telling that while one voice is lost to history, you can Google Stanley's name and get copious surface-level sources describing him as a hero for finding Livingstone, and this is something that wasn't just an unverified claim, but it didn't describe the totality of the horrors he perpetrated by tricking and enslaving people, among other things. George Washington Williams described the death and destruction that accompanied building military stations, where entire villages were burned to the ground if Native Africans refused to comply with European demands. Native Africans were forced to give over their food supplies to the Europeans, and if they didn't, the Europeans would murder them. And this is one of the first descriptions of mass death and mass killings that we have. Williams noted that for the slightest offenses, Africans could be pressed into chain gangs and subjected to cruelty, with yokes around their necks, and the metal would cut into their skin, creating sores and open wounds that flies would gather around as they worked. Williams noted that Leopold II's claims about building public works were a complete lie, and none of the European officials spoke the native languages of the population, which meant that all of the courts and alleged structure were inherently unfair. Just imagine if you got tried for having, I don't know, a pound of marijuana in your purse, but the entire trial and everything that happened in Hebrew. You wouldn't understand anything of what was going on. And I picked a language with kind of a different basis, unless you happen to be, a Hebrew speaker listening to this, in which case, think of another language. Just a language where you wouldn't have any context to even know where to begin in understanding it. That's kind of what I mean here. I'm not trying to pick on Hebrew. So Williams criticized the courts, and he said that the justice system was unfair, and he cited a poignant example. He basically witnessed a white servant of the governor general had gone unpunished for stealing wine, while black servants were falsely accused and beaten. However, I believe that the black servants were definitely slaves, and I do not believe that the white servants were actually slaves. Williams said that the white men trafficked African women and kept them as sex slaves against their will, and that Europeans were shooting Africans for sport, hunting them down, and using these hunting scenarios to intimidate people into doing their bidding. So this part will be a little graphic, so warning. Officers would wager with each other bids of around £5 as to whether they could hit an African person in the distance with their rifles, and then they would do it. They would make bets and gun down innocent people, and none of this bothered them. This was par for the course. There was no structure in place to stop this incredible cruelty, and in fact, cruelty was the law of the land. These mass killings, hunting for sport, capture, enslavement, and rape defined the Belgian Congo. And it wasn't a few bad actors, it was an intentional destruction and exploitation of a people. After his open letter, George Washington Williams wrote to the then President of the United States, President Harrison. We've moved on from good old Chester Arthur. And Williams described what he had witnessed and documented in the Congo in a lengthy and detailed report. And if you heard the title of one of these guys' books, you can bet your bottom dollar that this was truly detailed. He called for the Belgian government's occupation to be removed and for a new governing body to replace King Leopold II. He had started off admiring Leopold II, but with one visit to the Congo, he felt rage and disgust and anything you would expect from a person with basic empathy. And this concludes the scope of part 2 of the podcast. Don't forget to follow the podcast, subscribe however you do it to get to part 3. I don't have a Patreon, I don't use Twitter, so I'm unclear of where else to send you right now. You will seriously just have to subscribe until I sort this out, because this is my second ever episode and there's going to be more, because we are going to get into part 3. We'll talk about further details about the genocide, the international response to George Washington Williams' claims, and the reality of the oppressive and cruel government in the Belgian Congo, including more details of torture and mass killings that led to the annihilation of approximately 10 million people. Definitely stick around if you want to learn more about this, because we're getting really deep into this topic and I want to comment and cover all the important bits. So thank you so much for listening, and I will catch you in part 3.